Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Lindsay Harris, and I have the honor of being today's moderator. I'm an associate professor at the University of the District of Columbia's David A. Clarke School of Law, where I direct our Immigration and Human Rights Clinic. Today, we are thrilled that you're joining us for a very timely panel entitled The Civil Rights Lawyer, Perspectives on the Profession, and this is actually part 3 of a series, and we're focused today on staying well while doing good. So this is sponsored by the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice, and this panel is part 3 in a series of webinars exploring pathways into the profession of the civil rights lawyer. We are actively planning additional programming on a variety of issues, so please visit the website. It's americanbar.org/CRSJ for updates on these programs. Before we go into our program today, and how things will work with our fantastic panelists, I would like to introduce Angela J. Scott, who is the chair of the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice, for a few remarks to kick us off. Thank you, Angela.
Thank you so much, Lindsay, and thank you to all of our panelists who are here today and to our organizers, specifically Janelle George. I want to welcome all of you to our third installment of The Civil Rights Lawyer. Part of what we were trying to achieve when coming up with this series is how best we can assist and cater to practicing civil rights lawyers. There are many substantive groups within the ABA, and those groups focus on the professional development and the well-being of people in those specific areas. Our section is unique because we welcome you all. If you're a tax attorney, if you're an IP attorney, if you're, any type of attorney who cares about these issues, you are part of the section. And so I just wanted to make sure that we did carve out a space to provide for our members who actually are practicing attorneys so that they can receive what other attorneys are receiving in other substantive entities. With this series, we are going to focus on staying well while doing good. And I want to say, as a full-time civil rights attorney, as someone who is living in the world today in 2021, dealing with a global pandemic, as someone who focuses on these issues that we're all dealing with day and night, we know that there are still kids at the border. We know that African-American men are still being unjustifiably killed by the police. We know that there is an increase in Asian hate crime. We know that all of these things are occurring. And in addition to that, we are dealing with a pandemic that has taken many of our loved ones, our friends, our coworkers, our family members. We are truly in unprecedented times, and the nature of this work means that you have a heart, right? And people who have hearts tend to put others before themselves, and they tend to feel an obligation to do things for others before making sure that they themselves are okay. And so I am very happy that we are focusing on this issue today as someone who's going to be sitting back taking notes myself on how to deal with the situations that we find ourselves in today. I am so pleased to welcome people who can help us continue to do the good that we are trying to do and take care of ourselves at the same time. So I thank you all for being here. There's something for everyone, and just kind of buckle up and take notes like me. Welcome. I'll turn it back over to you, Lindsay.
Thank you so much, Angela, for giving us that kind of framework for what we're thinking through today. So during today's program, just a couple of logistical issues. We encourage you to ask questions, but please use the Q&A function, not the chat function. If you can't see that, then you just need to make sure your screen isn't idle. So click over it with your mouse. We're going to probably just address questions if we have time for them at the end of the panel, or I will weave them in as we go if we can. There will be a recording of this program for everybody who's registered, and so you can share it widely with your networks. But without further ado, I'd really like to introduce our three fantastic panelists today who really do bring a broad range of perspectives on the legal profession and the issues we'll be discussing. So hopefully, as I say their names and they can share more about themselves as we get started, they can maybe give us a little wave so you can identify them, and you should be able to see their names on the screen too. So first, we have Ty Dixon Darden, who is the CEO and principal consultant of Ty D Coaching and Consulting, Inc. She is an executive coach, a workplace culture strategist, and an adjunct professor at Howard University School of Law. We are also thrilled to be joined by Dr. Diane Kern, who is a licensed clinical psychologist. She is also the creator of Happy and Healthy You, the Learn to Love Life and Live Well series. And last but not least, we have Titilayo Tinubu Ali, who is Senior Director of Research and Policy at the Southern Education Foundation. So we are going to be talking about some challenging issues today. How do we stay well while doing good in the legal profession? 2020 actually saw the very first National Lawyer Wellbeing Week. You may have blinked and missed it because it was right in the beginning of the pandemic. So this panel today really builds on some of the concerns that we're seeing and that have been heightened during the pandemic around lawyer well-being, wellness. So I'd like to start where, for many of us, it all begins, which is in school, in law school. So I'm hoping we can hear from our lawyers on the panel, Ty and Titilayo, about your experiences with the culture of law school and how that kind of shaped the way you entered the legal profession. So I don't know who wants to kick us off, but please jump in and share your law school experience and how you think that tees us up for the way we walk through the legal profession.
Okay, well, I'm happy to jump in. One of the things that your question makes me think of is just how we come into being in law school in the first place. Like there's so much of the college environment, which has to do with those kind of pulling all-nighters, working super late, and often holding down jobs depending on who we are and the level of economic access we come into law school with during the time that we're going to school. I was one of the people who continued that in law school. So I had a job while I was attending law school, and so was working close to full-time during that time. And I found it to be something that when I started the practice of law, I continued to expect that schedule of myself. So I was no longer in school and working when I started at my first law firm, but I was still operating with those hours as normal in my mind as a paradigm, right? That I would be holding down these two very full-time endeavors. And that meant that it was quite, usual for me not to leave work until after 8 p.m. or 9 p.m. sometimes. And that felt like my normal workload. So I think that there's an important step that happens when you think about wellness and well-being to like adjust that in your mind really intentionally when law school and perhaps working during law school has ended. What is a realistic life that you want for yourself, and what are your real goals for that, and not just continuing that kind of unhealthy work cycle into the new world or what have you. So that is just one observation I have about how I entered. I was trying to continue the same when I should have stopped and interrupted that.
That's such an important point. I think at UDC Law, we have almost half of our students are actually in our evening program. So we have so many students who are coming to law school as a second career and really kind of making a transition, but they are just, I don't know how they do it. To any of you listening out there, the evening students are just incredible. Our day students are too, but they're juggling a great deal. And so kind of how do you ramp down the pace a little bit? And students often ask me, is it going to be the same when I'm in practice? Is it always going to be like this? Do you have any thoughts to add to Titilayo?
Yeah, so I, in a way, had a similar experience. Although I wasn't working in law school was a second career for me. So I had worked in communications and working in professional development for 8 years before law school and did grad school before law school. So I came into the whole law school process and even the 1L or 2L hiring process with a real clear sense of what working looked like and felt like. And so I could see that against what I was coming to understand of the law firm culture and could make some really clear decisions about what I was willing to do and not willing to do, right? The other interesting thing, while I was in law school, I got an opportunity to work on a research project that two Berkeley professors were doing. And it was on trying to understand how well the LSAT, so Ty mentioned it all starts then, how well that aligns with the actual skills that are required to be a successful attorney. And surprise, there isn't as much alignment as there should be, right? And so we know that, things like integrity, empathy, collaboration, creativity, critical thinking, some of those may come into our law school experience in the LSAT, but they don't. So many of them don't. So there's this conflict of, especially if you've already been in the workforce, knowing what it takes to engage and show up and do all the peopling we have to do in the real world, with, juxtaposed against the culture of what it takes to get into law school, what it takes to thrive while you're there, and then to enter into a culture that in many ways is sort of a hyper, version of the general sort of overworked culture, right? And so you're balancing all of those things. And I think it's just important to acknowledge and name that. And to the extent that we can, I know we'll talk about this more, push up against it. I've tried to do it in micro moments along the way, again, because I had that perspective. But I think that we all can look for opportunities to exercise some of that agency. And I know we'll be talking about some of that a little bit later.
Those are such important insights. And you mentioned the Berkeley professors who focused on the LSAT as a measure of attorney success. One of those same professors, I think, Marjorie Silver, has also done a lot of work in thinking around how law school doesn't really prepare you for the emotional realities of being a lawyer. So we focus a lot on teaching you to think like a lawyer, but not so much on how you deal with actually the stresses, the reality, the weight, right? The responsibility that we hold and carry often in cases, in projects, in advocacy efforts that have really serious ramifications, right? Especially for those of us who are in social justice, which will be most people attending today. And then there's also this concept of, within the kind of public interest, social justice, civil rights circles, of just putting the clients, the communities, the cause first and above yourself. So I'm wondering, Dr. Kern, as somebody who has worked with many lawyers over the years as a clinical psychologist, do you have any thoughts you'd like to add on the ways in which we are training and educating attorneys, and kind of just what you see working with attorneys in the field?
Well, much like most professional education at the higher end, unfortunately, people, as you've noticed and have already noted, get a lot of training in the actual practice, but very little preparation for what to expect in terms of actually the profession. So I think that is something to be prepared for. First of all, just to be prepared for the demands of law school and whether or not you're up for that, because it is a very rigorous environment. There are rigorous expectations, as people have already noted. You're on a rigorous schedule with a lot of demands on your time. And so even entering into law school and early on, just to understand the coping skills that are going to be involved with managing your time, managing your expectations, and rounding out your life. As someone already mentioned, having some level of pushback in terms of being able to take good care of yourself. So it would probably behoove a lot of law schools to begin to offer forums on some of the real life issues as people begin to consider different areas of law, specialties, what those look like. Obviously, there's some variations across the specialties, as well as across the various places where people practice law. For instance, in a firm versus in a government agency, that looks very different in terms of the time demands and your schedule and your productivity and energy levels. So being able to provide those experiences for people, perhaps allowing people to develop some shadowing opportunities or intern. Of course, there are internships that law students can get. So really taking advantage of that so that students can get a full array and preparation for what to expect. And also forming mentorship relationships so that people can truly shadow someone who's already out there doing what they would like to do so that they can develop a more realistic expectation. And kudos to the ABA for now appreciating what we now know across the board, especially in the health field, the importance of having work-life balance. And so this whole issue of well-being in any profession, that's important to address.
It's so important. Are there any other thoughts you all have on what law schools should maybe do differently as we prepare students for the realities of being a lawyer? Anything for you, Ty and Titilayo, that you kind of I mean, it sounds like you both went into law school with your eyes open, with, for some professional background, like you had already held down jobs and were out in the world doing your thing. But is there anything you wish you'd known or anything you wish your classmates had known as they prepared for the realities of lawyering? Specifically in the civil rights space, maybe? Ty?
Yeah, so my lawyering is a little bit different than my work in the civil rights space. So I think it's important to just clarify that, right? So I was a defense attorney in a private law firm, but I also have had about a 10-year career in nonprofit management and leadership, and some of that spent in policy and advocacy. So I just want to compartmentalize where I'm bringing my viewpoints from. But I think it's important to really bring law students around to the fact that the work environments are changing, whether or not some of the ways that we have learned to work in the law are still being held onto by some people. We're in the midst of just a workplace evolution that cannot be ignored in some ways, even in law, right? This one's even going to reach law, right? We're talking about inclusion, we're talking about work-life balance, we're talking about flexibility in new ways that law firms and that other entities of ways of practicing law, the government, all of the ways that you can enter into a workspace are going to have to consider how we make this really possible for people's lives, right? How we make it really sustainable for people's lives to work in our organizations. And I think that law students can be a really essential voice as newer starting attorneys in these entities to really be clear about what would make workplaces sustainable for them, right? Because each generation, each year of law student that enters is going to have a new set of information to offer to these organizations about what it really looks like for it to build longevity for them, right? So we've been talking a lot over these past years about what it takes to retain and develop workplaces around millennials, right? And now we have even more to consider as we add complexity and the COVID realities to the world that people have now learned about in terms of flexibility. Law firms need to answer that call for greater inclusion and flexibility, and the people entering can be the real voice when they are asked. But you have to be able to take a little risk to do that. And I think it's important to know that that risk is necessary to push these organizations forward to share truly what it's going to take for you to be able to build your career here. So I just want to encourage people to be honest about that when given the opportunity to contribute.
That is really powerful. And it makes me think about, the power of the individual to actually affect a culture, even if you're not the head of an organization, a firm, an entity. It can be really important. So we do want to make sure that everyone attending today walks away with some real kind of concrete tools for thinking about how you advocate for yourself and what would be sustainable for you, as Ty just highlighted. But before we get there, we've left law school, we're out in the workplace, we're in the legal profession in one way or another. I'm going to ask you each to share some perspective on workplaces so we can just identify what are the issues, right? What are the challenges to balance, to lawyer well-being? And then we'll talk about kind of how to fix them or navigate them. So Titilayo, can you kick us off with just what are some of the issues that we're seeing in the workplace?
Yeah, absolutely. And like Ty, I'll just frame my background a little bit so you know where I'm coming from. When I practiced law, I did labor and employment law on the defense side. And a large part of that, as many of you know, is helping organizations put policies, practices, and things in place so that there can be less opportunities for liability, right? And part of the, one of the things I've always been interested in is how we create those cultures that do attract and retain people. And I've taken that to all of my civil rights work that I do. I think there's some practical things like the personal and then the systemic. I always try to do both because I think that when we're talking about this, we have to acknowledge there's some things that are systemic, and then there's some things even within the context that we can do personally. So I'm so glad Dr. Kern is here. A friend of mine, I don't think she would mind me sharing this because she posted this publicly on Twitter. She's an in-house lawyer at a very popular tech firm. And she said, a lot of people, when I'm speaking and they're asking for mentorship advice and how to advance, they're shocked that one of the first things I say is therapy or some kind of way to be supported. And I think what the first step is to understand that many of us have gotten to where we are without support and probably with proving that we didn't need support to thrive and to succeed. And so a mindset shift of first just acknowledging what you're up against. Culture shift is not easy. Everything's the same until it isn't. And it's that messy middle that people don't really talk about, that ongoing pushback, finding your no, really being comfortable in knowing what your yes is. And that takes a level of fortifying yourself to be able to withstand that. And so I would say, determine what kind of support you need and get that. That's one. Also, the second thing I would say is really look at the data. I'm a researcher, so that can actually be an advocacy tool for you, right? And so, for example, I'm shocked by how many people still are not aware of the role that women are playing as breadwinners in their homes, right? And the role that Black women are playing as co-breadwinners or primary breadwinners in their home. Over 70% of Black women play that role in their home, right? That, knowing that data and communicating that, and you have to figure out when the conversation makes sense, puts you in a different position when you're negotiating your salary, right? Because there are a lot of assumptions that come with the fact that, oh, you have someone else who's carrying this for you, right? And when you are, and I'm speaking from the perspective of a woman who sits at many intersections, you have to deal with both the gendered and the racial and all of those things. And so I think arming yourself with an awareness of your value in the marketplace. I love what Ty said. Your choices matter. You know, we see virtual firms popping up that are really centering work-life balance in ways that just wasn't happening before. And the culture is really shifting, and where you choose to go can be a part of that. So acknowledge that it's okay to be supported. Find whatever support you need, and then arm yourself with whatever information you need, or even information about the various options and kinds of workplaces out there to equip you to make better choices for yourself that are in alignment with your values.
I love all of that. I took away from that it is okay, right, to ask for help in different ways. And that may be therapy for some of us. It may not. It may be just a different kind of network or mentorship, and figuring out when you're saying no and when you're saying yes, and being intentional about it, and so much more. But I want to talk a little bit more about how even within civil rights organizations, social justice entities, nonprofits, sometimes we're replicating some of the toxic dynamics, white supremacy culture, other things, biases, systemic issues that we see in society are actually, we see them again within the advocacy community. So I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about that, and then what we do about that, right? How that affects you and how you move through it. Ty, did you want to chime in, and then we can hear from Dr. Kern?
I can. And, you know, one of the things, I mean, I've worked at different nonprofits, but I've also worked with different nonprofits and leaders as a coach across, you know, dozens of those. And what I will say is that it is surprising, because very often people try to make this distinction between the corporate world or the law firm world and the nonprofit world. And even, you know, people in questioning my experience will often say, oh, I see that so much of your work is with nonprofits. Can you really apply this to the corporate world? And what I'll say is, you know, it's not that different, right? When people come together and engage in a shared enterprise, the human dynamics that happen. They happen in nonprofits, even if we have some sort of mission connection that brings us to the table at the same level. And they happen in law firms and in corporations and in the government. And it doesn't look that different, the things that we dispute over, right? People are looking for opportunities to make sure their voices are heard. They're looking for opportunities to make sure that they're clear on advancement. They're looking for sustainability with their lives, their personal goals, their families, their needs outside of work to be valued. They're looking to feel like they are appreciated and that they are celebrated for what they do best, right? There's no difference in that as you look at industry. I think what the nonprofit world, though, and the social justice world has that makes it slightly different is that this deep personal connection that brings us to our work creates an expectation that we're going to get some fulfillment back from it and some joy back from it. And that when we start operating in these traditional ways where productivity is the only thing that's being measured, and, you know, we're all behaving as if we're happy little workaholics, we find that we are taking away the very reasons which drew us to this work in the first place, which is joy and connection and meaning and that it makes us, feel a greater sense of fulfillment, right? Many people in these spaces find themselves going into this work for those reasons and then burning the midnight oil, burning through themselves, feeling completely burnt out, tired, and disinvested in their work and tired of it, when the whole point was to get fulfillment, right? So it's how do we set vision for ourselves that encompasses both hard work, productivity, advancement. Sure, all of those things are important. I don't mean to discount them, but also meaning and purpose and why we came, right? What is it that we're trying to make a difference for? And also remembering that we don't do anyone any tremendous service by burning through ourselves. If I don't make it with this commitment long enough to continue to serve my community, then I haven't helped anybody by being a martyr in this situation. I've taken away one of the soldiers for good because I didn't balance and make it sustainable for myself. So don't sacrifice yourself in these spaces for the good of the larger society or purpose that actually needs you in the long haul, right? We need you for the long haul pushing on these issues. We need you to become really experienced at doing this and do it better and better every year. So how do we bring that discussion into our spaces?
I'm really glad this is being recorded because I'm going to need to go back and write down all of that in detail to capture exactly as you said it. But Dr. Kern, so in this environment where there is always more work to do, right? If we are fighting for social justice and civil rights, our work is never done. How do we make sure that we are finding that balance and that joy, connection, fulfillment that drew us to the work in the first place? Do you have thoughts on this?
Well, I definitely am underscoring and piggybacking off of what Titilayo and Ty already have put on the table. And that is about having a reasonable mindset. And that's where it starts. It starts from our attitude. And let me talk about a framework that I utilize in order to approach our well-being. And that is to acknowledge, assess, and address. So it is important, as Ty just mentioned, to acknowledge what draws you to this work in the first place, what draws any of us to our work in terms of our mission, our sense of purpose, our sense of passion, the meaning that this work carries for us, because you're going to measure your successes or your accomplishments somewhat differently than perhaps if you're doing a different type of law, especially in this space of civil rights and social justice. So that's going to be critical. And definitely to underscore the importance of prioritizing your well-being. Just to go back to the proverbial airline model, put your mask on first, because you can't save anybody else if you can't breathe. So first of all, it is important in order to prevent burnout to engage in healthy self-care and to give yourself the permission and recognize the importance of prioritizing your needs. We know what happens when people get burned out. When people get burned out, not only do you suffer because you're burned out, you're depleted, now you're so stressed, and we recognize the mental and physical costs of being overly stressed, but also it is a setup to do harm to others. Unfortunately, people who are burnt out tend not only to be ineffective with the clients they're serving, but also in some cases take out their injuries, their hurt, as we say, hurt people. And so a lot of times they're not even in touch with. So that's where the acknowledgement and the awareness comes in. It's important that you recognize your own needs, where you are, much like Titilayo mentioned, to not be afraid or embarrassed or somehow or another confused about asking for help where you need it, and recognizing your needs. You're a human being too. And certainly in this space of civil rights and social justice, and especially if you're a Black attorney or an attorney of color or an attorney who's representing any of the groups that we're talking about that may be underrepresented, or where there are issues that you're advocating for, to recognize how they impact you. So that's very important to be on the forefront of that and recognizing those needs. So prioritizing your needs, creating balance. Again, we hear a lot about the work-life balance, and I'm really happy to hear how the legal profession is now recognizing the importance of advocating for that as well. But being able to advocate for that on your own personal level, as well as that, taking care of others, so that you can have the energy. One of the things I always remind people of whenever I'm doing any kind of workshop or working with my clients, I say, work is an important part of what you do. In this case, you have a profession. It's an important part of who you are, but it's not all of who you are. And your work is not all, and it should not be all of what you do. So don't let it define you. And then again, as Ty just mentioned, rob you of the very source of power that you have to influence change. Setting healthy boundaries, that's another major point that was already mentioned. Being able to recognize what you can and cannot do. It also aligns with setting reasonable and realistic expectations. Being able and willing to say no when it is simply too much, when you know that you're taking on something that exceeds your resources and your energy. And in that vein, also exercising reasonable time management. Celebrate your successes. Give yourself the permission to see where it is that you have made progress, where you have made a difference. And sometimes that may require you to redefine what that means. Sometimes we set ourselves up for this perfectionistic sense whereby nobody can achieve what it is we may be aiming for. And so, and oftentimes we miss that. And again, that's another recipe for burnout, is when we're constantly aiming for something that is unrealistic and we're just spinning our wheels. And certainly last but not least, that's to surround yourself with positive support. I'm a strong advocate of people getting a mentor. And certainly in addition to a mentor, somebody who, we know what a mentor is in terms of somebody who's mature, experienced, is operating in your best interest, and somebody you can trust. And also putting yourself in a network of people, network of your own colleagues, for instance. They may be people in the civil rights and social justice work, ideally, but not necessarily limited to that. But people who understand what you're going through, with whom you can feel safe, and who can validate your experiences. That's specifically within the social justice and civil rights, work. That's important to recognize that, yes, what I'm going through is real. And, how do I deal with that? How do I utilize strategies to help me do this work and to help me stay well?
There is so much there that you've just given to us, Dr. Kern, so thank you. On your last point about kind of networks, right? I just did a national study of asylum attorneys, so attorneys representing asylum seekers. And now everyone knows who asylum seekers are, thanks to the Trump administration and their very focused policies to dismantle and undermine asylum protection for people fleeing violence and persecution. And it was a survey of 718 attorneys. And I will just say on the piece about kind of networks and being plugged into having like-minded people to engage with, the most burnt out category of people, the study measured burnout and secondary trauma using a couple of different psychological scales and tools. And the most burnt out group and the group suffering from the highest level of vicarious trauma were solo practitioners, right? So those individuals who don't necessarily have the network within a small, medium, or large firm or a nonprofit, within academia, or within a big entity of some kind. So I do just want to underscore that point, right? That if you don't have that built into your daily practice, then you need to figure out how to get that, right? How to integrate yourself into a group of people who can understand what you're going through and empathize with that and really hear you. But I am sure that Titilayo and Ty have thoughts, in response to what Dr. Kern just mapped out for us, and ideas as well, or maybe how you kind of try to implement some of those concepts in your own careers or assisting other people. Titilayo?
Yeah, sure. So I would say, a lower risk way to develop some of these skills is just to try it out with other people in your life first. Because I assure you, we all, life as a human is about boundaries being ruptured, being set, you crossing other people's boundaries without knowing it. We have the personal and professional, we're told to keep them separate, but we know the reality is the same, right? We are the same people at home who are coming into work and doing this work. And so we're talking about developing skills that serve you in any human relationship. So low-hanging fruit, try it out on your friends or try it out at home, right? How have you developed the ability to say no and center your needs and all of those things just in your own personal relationship? So try that out. Another thing I would say is really lean into leadership. And this is, I know that there's a level of paying your dues, right, that happens, but also recognize, and Ty has mentioned this, that in this profession, you occupy a level of privilege and access that many people don't. And it's the case that you will actually be the one setting culture for other organizations. Maybe you'll run one, maybe you'll sit on boards, maybe you'll rise into partnership, or maybe you'll go somewhere and do something else. So we all are the ones who are going to create that new culture. So lean into opportunities when we have chances to lead. So look for, whether it's in your firm, if you're at a firm, or in your community, where can you lead and set culture? And how can you practice, even if you just have an intern or a summer associate working with you, how can you try to set culture on a micro level, knowing that you're preparing yourself to do it on a macro level? Because we actually really need you all to be the leaders of the future. If anything, if this is going to change, those who are interested in this conversation, I would love a world where my boys, I have twin 5-year-olds, I want them to grow up where people like this are making decisions. So we have to start now practicing that. Another thing I want to say is, the last thing is just managing your care. So a lot of people in this social justice work, we have big hearts, we get squishy, right? We come to this work because we're passionate about it and we care about it. And that combination, with just the type A kind of people that the law practice attracts, we can tend to think this problem is so big, only I can solve this problem, right? And we forget how many people, there are 127 people in this room, how many other people are working and caring as we're doing this work, right? And so if we can think of, I'm very interested in biomimicry and how nature works and how people can sort of operate more collectively as well. Even in those moments, think about, like, how can I trust and rely on the fact, whether it's my colleagues or just other people doing this work in the field, that even if I have to set a boundary or pull back, someone else is carrying the load and this will get done, right? So think about how you can manage your care. Think of this more globally and more collectively. And I think it's actually a beautiful thing that at least to me, it feels like there are more people interested in this work, doing this work, and we have to be here if it's going to continue. So let's try to do it in a way that's collaborative, and know that when you're centering yourself, someone else is out there doing the work, and hopefully they'll take a break when you step back in.
Yeah, that's so important to remember. Ty, why don't you jump in and share what you're thinking?
Yeah, so one of the things I'm thinking about, and this is definitely accompanying what Titilayo has just shared, is thinking about the importance of modeling and the importance of mentorship, and really talking about these things. So I think we talk a lot, especially as women leaders, we talk a lot about how to advance. We talk a lot about how to shatter glass ceilings. We don't talk a lot about either the intentional trade-offs we make, because this world has some real go times, right? The legal world has go time. It has trial time. It has times when a big deal is going through. It has times that need a lot of your attention and a lot of overdrive. And then how we negotiate the space that we need to take for ourselves in between that. We don't always talk about that. We only talk about the work, how to advance in the work, how to be recognized for the work, how to earn what you need to for the work. So we need to actually ask people, what are they doing to maintain their balance and sense of sanity between these things, right? The only reward in the law for good work is more work, I always say. And so, and as it turns out, that if you do a great job, people are just going to send you 10 more things to do, which is great. But how do the leaders in this space really share with us what they do to take care of themselves? And it makes me think of just one particular instance when I was an associate at a law firm, and a partner and I and another associate were preparing for a trial that was just really difficult to prepare for. Voluminous boxes of documents were getting ready to be sent out of state for us to go to trial. We had been, burning the midnight oil for a month, and the trial was settled. And I said to the partner, she said, "What are you going to do with your weekend now that the trial was settled?" I was like, "Oh, I still have, 30 other things to do." And she said, "No." She said, "Let me tell you how this works, right? When something happens that's a success, you have to pull back. You have to acknowledge that success. Otherwise, you're going to flame out so quickly in this work." And what she did when she saw that her associate's mindset was that they were going to continue to work through the weekend, even though we'd settled this case that was about to take us to trial, she invited us out to St. Michael's, which is here, I live in Maryland, waterfront, to get on her boat with her and her husband and have a beautiful dinner waterfront with her to celebrate the fact that something good had happened. And she said that she was going to stay there for the next 4 days. For me, that was pivotal, right? Because what it let me know was, okay, you have to protect this constant flow of more, and say, wait a minute, I have some control here. And where I do have control, where go time has stopped, I need to fully absorb that and take a moment to take care and restore the practices that make me whole so that I can be sharp and ready for the next go time. So we just have to acknowledge that there is these, burn times that come in the law. It's very hard to avoid them, but what do we do to take care of ourselves in between? And how do we ask people who are successful at that to really tell us how?
I love that, Ty. I think that, I actually try and do this at UDC, at our law school. Every time I bring in attorneys who are out practicing, our panels are usually talking about something else. It's not usually an entire panel dedicated to well-being and self-care, right? But that should be a question. We should be asking that question on every panel, right? About every civil rights victory or important issue that we're discussing. Like, how do you, as someone in this work right now in this moment, how do you take care of yourself, right? How are you doing that? So that we can hear that it's okay to do that. It is okay to, as Titilayo says, to step back and take that space. And also celebrate the big wins and the small ones too. I'll tell a very short story. I was walking out of court a couple years ago with a bunch of law students, and we had actually just won a case in immigration court for a 21-year-old man from Honduras who was fleeing gang violence. Those are really hard cases to win these days, right? So we're walking out of court, and it must have been like 3 years ago because I was heavily pregnant at the time. And I was like, all right, we're going to go get milkshakes. And the student was like, why? What? Huh? And I was like, we're going to celebrate. She's like, oh, I guess it's just kind of a drop in the bucket though. And I was like, yes, it is. It is one person, right? It is one person, but his life has been profoundly changed. And we have so many other clients we need to help, and many more who are knocking on our door who would like our services and services like them. But we need to take this moment, right? Even just to sit together and debrief and like have milkshakes or whatever kind of beverage you need at that point. For me, that point, heavily pregnant, it was a milkshake. And we need to celebrate that, right? And just, I love what Titilayo said about the importance of modeling, and Ty backed her up on that we need to, as lawyers out there in the profession, show people who are coming up in the profession that it's okay to take those moments to celebrate. 4 days on a sailboat sounds amazing, but it's so key. Dr. Kern, I'm wondering if you have other thoughts in response to what's been shared. I think one topic that's come up is this concept of how do you say no, right? Especially once you are established in the legal profession and you're doing well in doing good, how do you set boundaries? How do you actually kind of inventory the choices that you're making and decide when to say yes to something?
Well, before we go there, if you don't mind, I will just like to piggyback off of Titilayo's and Ty's wonderful examples of, again, celebrating victories, modeling, because that's what changes the culture. Those are the examples and opportunities for attorneys to share and to model and to usher in new attorneys and set a whole new expectation about what's okay and what's allowed, and therefore you can reset your own expectations around being successful. And being successful is about striking that balance between the self-care and, again, serving others well and doing a good job in that arena. With regard to setting boundaries, it really is about one's expectations. And I always talk about setting realistic and reasonable expectations about what you can do and what you cannot do. It's interesting, the example that you just gave about the asylum work. And having worked along with some asylum attorneys in the past, I certainly, understand the gravity of that, because again, your ability to recognize and celebrate the victory around helping one person is huge. That's significant. So part of that is adjusting, again, defining, your ability to say, I'm celebrating the small victories as well as the big victories, and not taking on so much or setting the bar so high that you can't even tackle it. So again, this is about recognizing what's reasonable to take on. You cannot save the world. Nobody can save the world. I think Titilayo made the point about recognizing that you're surrounded by other attorneys in this work, the civil rights, social justice work, so that you can recognize that you're not the only one holding up, this major mantle here, so that we are not the saviors of this world. So therefore, really being able to put that in perspective, being reasonable and realistic about it, because then you can kind of come back to earth and realize, wait a minute, I simply don't have time to take this up. And again, when you prioritize your own well-being and recognize the importance of your own well-being, it becomes much easier to see that line, to see the line between when it's enough and too much. So that's really very important. Giving oneself permission to step back. And again, that's where self-awareness becomes very important, because it's very important to stay in touch with and to be able to assess, how am I doing? Am I exhausted? Am I finding myself being irritable? Am I finding myself worn out, fatigued as a result of this work? Am I, as a result of working too much or taking on too many tasks, or tackling things that really I cannot do, and not asking for help? Am I now drowning? So being in touch with how you're doing emotionally while you're doing this work, and not being afraid, as has been mentioned before, to ask for help.
Yeah, and I just saw that was so good. I just saw a question in the comments: how do you say no without consequence? And I just have to say, sometimes we say no and there are consequences, right? I mean, I think we have to sit in the reality that, I don't think what we're after is a world in which there are no conflicts and there are no, there's just complete ease, right? There's some place where we get to where everyone understands our boundaries, everyone respects what we need to do for self-care. I'm not sure we'll ever get there. I think what we're after is building a level of resilience and ability to withstand differences, right? So it may very well be that your values aren't in alignment with the culture of that organization. And then at that point, there's a decision to make, right? Do I want to stay there and with that awareness and maybe strategically operate a little different, temper my expectations, feed myself to nourish myself in other ways, right? To withstand this culture, and maybe even amp up your self-care a little bit if you make that decision to stay. But I just want to be clear, there are definitely consequences to saying no. And I think it's about us just being aware of that and aware of what risks and benefits we personally have and what decisions we're willing to make. And also, sometimes no isn't no, right? Sometimes no is, oh, I would love to help you with this. Here's when I can do it based on these other things on my plate. And if you're talking to a partner, would you like me to move something down on the list of priorities to raise this up to a level of priority, right? So some of it is just negotiating the relationships and thinking about how you might be able to get that thing done in a way that still achieves that goal, but also maintains your center. But just to say, yes, there are consequences. And I think what we need to work on collectively and even culturally is thinking about how do we manage those points of conflict and building those skills so that we aren't so, taken aback when they happen.
That's right. May I add to that, please? Yes, absolutely. I applaud. Thank you to Titilayo for talking about. I hit a workshop that said no is not a nasty word, and don't be afraid of no. And sometimes that as you alluded to, that is where we really take back our own responsibility. I always ask people, who's responsible for your well-being, your happiness? And it's you. It's us. We are responsible for that ourselves. So that it is important that we recognize when we stand up for, advocate, and assert, and take responsibility for our own well-being, that then, as you said, realistically, there are going to be some people who may not value that. That's up to us to value it. And if we don't value it, it doesn't make sense for us to expect somebody else to value it more. And as you said, that might then determine whether or not wherever we happen to be at the time is a good place for us, is a healthy workplace. I always talk about healthiness. Is this going to be an environment that's in line with your well-being and your health? And if you make that, and like you said, then you have a choice. You can either do what you can to change it. That's a possibility. A no does not necessarily have to be a firm no without any kind of flexibility, as you also indicated. And or maybe it is time to leave. And I have worked with people as a therapist. I have worked with attorneys, I mean, doing very well financially, who realized that their happiness meant actually choosing another profession. And that's an extreme, obviously, but a couple of people have come to that decision.
So this is all super helpful. I want to recognize a few of the questions in the Q&A, which are along the same lines, and also just plant this seed, which is that we've alluded to it, but we are in the middle of this pandemic. And for many lawyers and professionals, this has meant that we are really blurring the lines between the personal and professional. And I know we have a couple of other moms of young children on the panel too, but people are coming into our homes, right? Our clients, our students, our colleagues, people, our interns, everybody we're engaging with, judges sometimes, right? We're literally appearing in court from our living room or basement or closet. So how does that change things? But the questions, there's a couple of questions that are along the same lines about kind of setting boundaries and saying no when there are power dynamics at play, right? So when it's your boss or someone in power who's asking you to do something. And then how do we respond when people are not considerate of our time? So calling and asking for legal advice without an appointment, or even considering whether we have the kind of mental capacity at that moment to listen to their problems. So do we have any thoughts on this? We're getting towards the end of our time together. So I'll put it out there for anyone to jump in. I think, Ty, you were about to chime in.
Yeah, and I will tie in what you've asked to here, but I think, what I was going to chime in on is that so much of this is about interrogating limiting narratives that we tell ourselves. And I also think we tell a lot of limiting narratives to each other in preservation of our own worldviews, because we want to affirm them by giving advice to other people that they are correct. What I mean by that is this narrative, or this thing that we pass around as lawyers, that if you say no, you'll be fired on the spot. There's some cases where that's absolutely maybe true for some people. It's probably very rare. There is some reality around human beings where we want them to be able to continue and survive their work, right? We want them to be able to thrive. And if they're sharing with us, this no has a reason behind it, which is there's actually a limit to what they can produce. This is actually not possible or practicable for them without staying up all night for 5 days, right? You've got to say no. You've got to say no if it's not possible. But I also think this idea that I want to weave into, which is what I was going to comment earlier, is that we have to also ask ourselves, what am I telling myself that holds me in these positions where I feel like I can't speak, I feel like I can't leave, I feel like I don't have options, and I feel like this is the only way up, right? Because a lot of law, what I remember about the conversations was we were passing each other these limiting beliefs that this is the only way. If you want to make partner, this is the only way. If you want to earn X amount, this is the only way. If you want prestige, this is the way you get prestige. This is where it is. And then also negative narratives about other paths, right? So I was told a lot of times in my life, if you go into social justice, civil rights, nonprofit work, there's no money in it. If you're right, all these negative things that we pass, right? And it wasn't until I started interrogating those things for truth that I started to realize, wow, some of this is not even true. There are ways to earn money and do good. There are ways to say no and survive. There are ways to decide that something doesn't make sense for you and this path is not the ladder you want to get to the top of, and get on a different ladder and be wildly successful, right? We got to stop doing that to each other, and we got to stop doing it to ourselves, passing on these unhelpful, limiting beliefs that aren't even based in reality. And so when you are hearing something that's holding you in place and holding you from speaking, ask yourself, is this really true? I mean, I know that seems so basic and obvious, but like I have to very often ask myself, is this true? Is it true that I can't earn money another way? Is it true that I can't be, and I'm not even saying leaving the law, another way, even in the law, right? Is it true that everywhere I go, this is going to be my toxic experience? Is it true that this is the only way I can use my skills? Or is that what somebody told me that I'm manufacturing to hold myself in place? Or is it what I told myself, right? So pause for a second and interrogate that belief and see if it's actually based in any truth.
That is so powerful. We have an important question in the chat, and that is about burnout. And if you have gotten to that point where you are burnt out. So I know in 2019, the World Health Organization actually formally recognized burnout as a phenomenon, right? As a diagnosis. So basically the emotional, physical exhaustion as a result of our work. How do you, and maybe this is a question for you, Dr. Karen, how do you recover? How do you recover from burnout when you have gotten to that point? What do you need to do to move forward?
Well, certainly, as has been mentioned before, asking for help. Again, being in touch with the fact that you are burned out is the first step. Recognizing the pain, your source of distress, and what's causing the distress, and being honest with yourself about that, caring enough about yourself and giving yourself the permission to get the help that you need. And that if you've reached that point, yes, maybe it is time to reassess what it is that is causing this and whether or not it's a function of not having taken care of yourself, and maybe pushing beyond your own boundaries, and now either getting the help. And so generally, that is the time to get some kind of help, at the very least, some kind of social and professional support from others who can help give you a clearer view of what's going on and where you are, and provide that support for you to make some changes. And certainly at the professional level or the clinical level, perhaps to get therapy, where you can step back and really re-examine how you're doing with regard to your own sense of self, and to be able to redefine your direction in terms of what might truly give you meaning, and then cultivate those ways of coping and managing your energy, your time, and directing your talents.
And take your paid time off. So about 55% of Americans who have paid leave do not take it, right?
Absolutely.
And only 25% of Americans even have it. So I think that if you're a lawyer, you probably do have it, right? Because most of those in the 25% are in lower wage, lower paying jobs. Take your leave, right? I mean, that's like a simple micro thing. Now, I know there's a culture in law firms around like, who hasn't taken a vacation in 5 years? I get it, right? The culture is there. But this is like, goes back to that, other thing we said about those little micro decisions, those micro moments of agency. When you do have resources available to you, take them.
That's right.
And I'll just add one more. I think set a vision. I know that sounds really hokey, especially to really practical action-oriented people, right? I get that a lot. But I do think that if we don't know what we're striving for, you can't just work and work and work to no end, right? To no set of purpose-driven reasons why you work. For me, what it meant was, this work is not intended to be my life. It's intended to support my life. It's intended to fulfill my life. It's intended to enhance my life. It's intended to let me do good in the world with the instrument I've been given. But if I don't write down what that means for me, and I just work, and let my successes and failures at work be my sole determinant of whether or not I have value in the world and whether or not my life has value, I will quickly calculate that, I could be more and more perfect at work. But if we don't have a vision for what we're trying to get from working and whether or not we're getting there, then we have nothing to assess whether our jobs fit us, whether we need to request balance, right? We don't know what we're striving for. So if there is time just to pull back and say, sometimes people do this with a coach. I'm not plugging coaching just because myself, and I know Titilayo is also a coach, but coaching is one way. But if it's not coaching, then a trusted friend or someone who can sit down with you and who you can share your desired outcomes with for your life, not just your work. And then you can help to assess what you're actually doing against those, and are you meeting them? If you have a different vision over your life than what you're accomplishing, you can change that. You're 100% in control. So that's just one thing that I want to say before we part, because a lot of people forget to pull back and set vision and just end up climbing ladders they don't want what's at the top of.
Ooh, this is really hard to moderate, because every single time one of our panelists speak, I just want to sit and think about what they said for like 10 minutes. So I encourage you all to take some time and do that, because there's been such rich, valuable, generous insight shared today by each one of these incredible women. So we are at our time, and I know folks have to hop off, so you want to respect your time. Thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate, especially the time of each of our panelists. Really, you're doing such important work to educate all of us and share your insight. The section of Civil Rights and Social Justice provides free webinars like this, along with resources for legal professionals and advocates nationwide. We hope that this helps you in your work. And if you want to join and become active in the ABA, you can do so at ambar.org/CRSJ. Thank you all so much for this. If you want to share any parting words, please do, but I'm sure people have to start hopping off. So for those of you who do, please stay safe, stay well, and thank you for joining us this afternoon.